Jerusalem, the holy city for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. In particular, we are now in front of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the heart of the whole Christianity. 8 centuries ago, St. Francis met the Sultan Malik al-Kamal and established here the Provincia Oltremare, or Provincia di Terra Santa, where the Franciscans belong, and they were called here to safeguard the holy places or the whole Christianity. But they don't just safeguard these places, they have to look after the lives of the Christians who live here. In fact, their activities are collocated into a multicultural context with a lot of Oriental languages spoken, and that's why we have to go to the General Library of the Franciscans in the custody of the Holy Land.
The collection of ancient books and manuscripts form an important part of the General Library of the Custody of the Holy Land. They are the silent testimonies of 700 years of life and work amid some of the most glorious moments as well as the most trying moments of Franciscan history in the Holy Land. The present collection owes its existence to the hard work and inspiration of Father Agustin Arce, who some 70 years ago reorganized the General Library and began collecting and preserving the ancient patrimony of written records. From the monasteries of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, Emmaus, Jaffa, and other parts of the Franciscan custody as far as Syria and Egypt, these manuscripts and books are now housed in this General Library. The collection includes some 600 manuscripts in 6 different languages, spanning from the 13th century to the 18th century. Among these are illuminated manuscripts of liturgical and prayer books used by the first Franciscans when they arrived in the mid-1200s. There is also a collection of pharmaceutical and medical books from the 16th century to the 18th century, used by the Franciscan friars when they administered to the local population to alleviate common illnesses, as well as in times of plague and pandemic. Another notable section of this library is the diaries and itineraries of the pilgrims in the Holy Land. Spanning from the 14th century to the 18th century, these books record the development of the holy places and how the daily liturgical life took place during these years. A substantial portion of the collection is of a linguistic nature. They include dictionaries and grammars of the local languages compiled by the friars or were acquired from overseas. These attest to the Franciscan commitment to work with the sheer diversity of local communities, to live among them and to learn their languages and cultures. In its heyday, it stretched from Armenia to Egypt, from Rhodes and Cyprus to Syria. These books are the silent testimony of this heritage.
Almost 2 years after the last online exhibition, the project Books, Bridges of Peace has finally managed to launch a new bibliographical venture called Grammatica, Orientalia, Hierosolymitana, lexicons and grammar books of Semitic languages between 16th and 18th century from the Franciscan Library in Jerusalem, and is dedicated to the linguistic tools used by the Franciscan friars of the Holy Land to study and to learn the most important Semitic languages such as Arabic, Hebrew, Syriac, and Ethiopic, that is the Ge'ez alphabet.
In Italian, the word grammar means both study of a language, set of rules that govern it, and book, manual, that describes and collects the rules of a language. That's why we can say to a student, study grammar, but also get the grammar or buy a French grammar. In Western culture, the first grammatical concepts were developed by Greek sophists, and, on the other hand, the word grammar itself, through the Latin Ars Grammatica, dates to the Greek Grammatike techne, which means science of reading and writing. It is important to note that the original term had a clear link with writing. The grammarian, the educated person who can read and write, is the opposite of the layman who makes mistakes and therefore needs to be guided. So, the fundamental purpose of a grammar is to teach the good use of the language to those who do not know it yet. That is to say, mother tongue pupils, but its purpose is also to help those who want to learn a foreign language. These two purposes are already present in the first printed grammar of a modern European language. The famous Grammatica Castellana, Castilian grammar, by Antonio de Nebrija, who dedicated the work printed in 1492 to Queen Isabella la Cattolica. The dedication to a queen let us to well understand the political destination of this grammar. As Nebrija himself clarifies, it's in the very first line of the prologue with a very famous sentence, siempre la lengua fu compañera del imperio. We can therefore say that knowing and studying grammar means starting from a reflection on language in order to better know the different cultures and more generally to better understand human relationship in their complexity.
The catalog, which is available on the General Library website, is divided into 4 sections following chronological order of the books shown, except the last section, which is dedicated to a specific topic. The first section demonstrates the first interest on the study of Oriental languages and the start of some of the most important publishing enterprises during the 16th century, such as the Tipografia Medici Orientale in Rome. Then the development of this particular publishing sector, especially in the religious sphere, with a focus on the extraordinary activity of the polyglot printing house of the Congregation of Propaganda Fide, also in Rome. In the end, the growth of interest on Oriental studies, not only in the religious circles, but also in scholarly, commercial, and political diplomatic ones.
Being surrounded with so many amazing books showcasing the history of language learning over the ages, one can lose track of the fact that learning languages is not only a universal phenomenon, it's also an historical one with real people having different motivations of engaging different languages for different reasons. As the different contributors of the catalog made so very clear, learning ancient classical languages, Oriental languages, was so often motivated by religious motivations, and this is a very important fact that situates this cognitive phenomena of learning languages back into history. But then we need to start asking ourselves, the history of what? Of whom? Why would different people learn different languages? And I think from all the books here behind me and that you see online, one of the best books to really win the attentions of different people learning different languages for different motivations is this one. Not a very modern binding, but still a very ancient book with Mikne Avraham by the Jewish grammarian and doctor Abraham de Belemis, who worked in Venice. And what makes this grammar book so very interesting is that it has both a Hebrew aspect of it and a Latin one, oftentimes face to face. So the Hebrew grammar and the Latin translation of the Hebrew grammar. And here we can't but wonder, so who was this book intended for? Was it intended for Jews who wanted to learn Hebrew, their own sacred language, to learn the sacred scripture? Or was it intended for Christians who wanted to start learning their own Holy Bible and use Hebrew for that, as was so common in the 16th century? And this book doesn't give us any simple answer. So the writer, the Jewish grammarian, writes in the introduction to this book, he intends to be entirely for the Jewish people that needs to reunite with their own holy language. On the other hand, you move a few pages forward, and the printer, Daniel Bomberg, the famous printer of Hebrew in Venice, writes already a very different introduction and makes pretty clear that he intends this book to be used for anyone that wants to learn Hebrew, for any Christian wanting to learn Hebrew. You continue paging through the pages, and the riddle doesn't become any easier. On the one hand, the Hebrew grammarian writes again that about the history of the Hebrew language, and he bases this on Plato and Socrates, not exactly the people you would imagine a Jew to draw on. And then a few pages later, you see that he's actually engaged in a very internal Jewish discussion about how to think about the Hebrew grammar, a discussion going back way into the Middle Ages. And in many ways, this book is actually a very radical vision of Hebrew grammar from within the Jewish tradition. So one could say that this is a Hebrew grammar intended for Jews and translated into Latin for Latin readers. But then, what I find very interesting about this book is its page layout. Hebrew grammars traditionally did not use a table to represent conjugations and declensions. The invention of a table for conjugations and declensions is something very Latin, very Christian, developed in Italy in the 15th century. And here we find that the Hebrew grammarian also, maybe under the influence of the Latin grammarians, maybe this was the decision of the printer, started to organize verbs and tables much like you would often encounter only in Latin grammars. So I think this grammar offers us many interesting questions, but unfortunately doesn't give us a very easy answer.
Questa ricerca ci fa vedere ciò di cui si sono nutriti i frati della custodia di Terrasanta e ciò che hanno prodotto anche alcuni dei loro superiori, non solo il riscatto dei luoghi santi, ma anche la preparazione culturale e l'inculturazione dei frati. Dalle opere che compaiono in questo catalogo sono molti i francescani che hanno prodotto grammatiche e dizionari. Vorrei menzionarne due. Il primo è padre Mario da Calascio, abruzzese di origine ma romano di adozione, che era specialista in lingua ebraica e nel corso della sua vita ha prodotto una grammatica ebraica, un dizionario e la sua opera maggiore, che è una concordanza biblica dell'Antico Testamento in 4 volumi. Questa concordanza è presente nella biblioteca, ma ovviamente non compare nel catalogo, perché il catalogo è dedicato a grammatiche e dizionari. Vorrei però ricordare il suo dizionario, glossario ebraico, latino-italiano, non tanto per la quantità e l'ampiezza del contenuto, ma perché è uno dei primi dizionari di ebraico in cui compare la spiegazione del lemma anche in lingua italiana. Questo è molto importante. Il secondo personaggio che vorrei ricordare è padre Tommaso Vicini da Novara, che fu anche custode di Terrasanta. Abitò qui a Gerusalemme e viaggiò per il Medio Oriente fra il 1612 e il 1621, circa 10 anni. Poi andò a Roma e qui fondò una scuola per l'insegnamento della lingua araba, e di lui in questo catalogo compaiono 2 opere. La prima è una grammatica araba, il compendio di una grammatica di madrelingua tradotto in latino e annotato, la grammatica di Ibn Ajrum, che noi chiamiamo ed è nota col nome Ajrumiyya, E poi ha prodotto anche un thesaurus, cioè un lessico di varie lingue. Sono opere che si trovano facilmente qui nella biblioteca custodiale perché venivano usati come libri di testo per lo studio della lingua. Sembra dal catalogo che la grammatica di Padre Obicini sia presente in almeno 15 copie e questo è veramente un tesoro prezioso. Oltre ad essere un tesoro dal punto di vista librario, ci fa capire quanto sia stato a cuore ai francescani lo studio delle lingue. Era una priorità. I francescani hanno cercato sempre di inculturarsi e di poter interagire con le popolazioni locali che allora erano di lingua araba.
Robert Boyle is today remembered mostly as a leading figure in the scientific revolution. He is often regarded as the father of chemistry, as a natural historian, and basically one of the most important scientists working in England just a generation before Isaac Newton. It's rarely remembered today that also this very scientific individual had a part of his life which he devoted completely to learning ancient languages. As so many other individuals who engaged these books we have here behind me, he was also did this due to religious motivations. He wanted to read the scripture in the original language. And Boyle had always this very difficult relationship between words and things. Res and verba. He, on the one hand, said as a natural historian, he only wants to learn natural phenomena. And he hated the study of bare words. On the other hand, he engaged learning languages since he was 7, starting with Latin and French, then moved on to Eton, learning Latin and maybe a bit of Greek. And then in the 1650s, he had a period that he was renowned universally as a grammarian, as some of his friends said. Now, it's interesting to think of this dichotomy between natural history and humanist languages, humanist study of ancient languages, because we often think of these two as different poles of the intellectual landscape of 17th century Europe. But at least in Boyle's case, you can see how both of these met. So the book I have here is דקדוק לשונות הקדם של עברים וקושדים וארמים, or in its more familiar Latin name, Grammatica Linguarum Orientalium Hebraeum Chaldearum Syriacum, from the renowned grammarian Ludovico de Dio. This grammar book is not a regular grammar book, it's a comparative grammar book, basically comparing the languages of Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, and sometimes Greek, and using throughout the Latin grammar as the lingua franca, as something that everyone can know and do. Now, there is a good reason why few people remember today that Boyle had a period in which he was obsessed with learning languages, and that is that there is basically no manuscript surviving from this period in Boyle's life. The only manuscript that does survive is fragmentary. It's just a few notes, and it's a few notes about this book. And what you see in Boyle's study of ancient languages is that he approached this exactly like he would later approach in life natural history. He was systematic. He tried to draw comparisons. He tried to find laws. Exactly the stuff that he would be later famous for when he studies pioneering studies in chemistry or in meteorology, try to find patterns in natural phenomena. So it's an interesting thought to wonder whether Boyle first began to be a scientist when he actually learned ancient languages and only then turned his gaze into natural history.
The last section, as we said, deviates from the chronological order of the first 3 sections because it's dedicated to the Polyglot Bible, which is the holy text printed in the most important ancient languages and alphabets of Near and Middle East. In particular, here is shown the lexicon Heptaglotton, which is one of the most important linguistic tools published with the Walton Polyglot Bible, published in London between 1654 and 1657. The material presented in this catalog is therefore particularly valuable, not only as a witness to some of the most important cultural and editorial initiatives at the turn of 3 centuries, but also because demonstrate the use of these tools, of these books, by the Franciscan friars of the Holy Land in history, and also because it's a particularly rare book collection of a specific great interest.
A certain interest for foreign languages belongs to pilgrimage by default. As a centripetal movement, one is bound to be confronted at the center by people coming from other regions and speaking other languages. In the 16th century, having a certain notion of the world's languages, whatever the world was seen as one of the first ways of knowing. Thomas Brude's first book of the introduction of knowledge was a kind of periplus that presented countries and provided samples of their languages and ended in Jerusalem. The Spanish poet and pilgrim Alonso Gómez de Figueroa prides himself on having seen pretty much everything, and in Egypt, quote, alfabetos griegos, babylones, maromitas, persianos. Such were the expectations that even fictional or semi-fictional travelogues like Mandeville's or Thomas More's Utopia came with their own invented alphabetical charts. Even today, posters with alphabetical charts are often seen at souvenir shops in Jerusalem's Old City. As historians, we can access the connection of pilgrimage and foreign languages only through written or printed sources. Back in the day, those sources served various pragmatic, comparative, or magical functions. Most basically and practically, a word list could help a pilgrim or traveler to get by in an unfamiliar environment, as it provided him, or very rarely her, with some basic words and sayings in the strange tongue. The Biblioteca Nazionale di Firenze, for example, holds a 15th century word list with Arabic and Ethiopian useful words and phrases translated into Italian and Latin and coming with an itinerary from Venice to Ethiopia. The convergence of various languages at the pilgrim's destination or at a monastery or caravansary along the journey could trigger comparative operations driven by concerns for theological consistency or by a certain playful curiosity. While the pilgrim Sebastian von Rottenham translated phrases like know thyself, gnotis auton, into Syriac and modern colloquial Greek, the pilgrim Arnold van Harf was keen to translate the phrase voulez-vous coucher avec moi ce soir in every language he presents in his travelogue. Within travelogues, foreign languages served to impress at home and in the form of glossaries containing expressions in foreign languages or in the form of unfamiliar scripts and alphabets helped to augment his credibility. Travelers often encountered skepticism on their return. Alphabetical charts with letters never seen before could convince a dubious readership and, paradoxically, also convince analphabetic onlookers that something strange had happened on the way to the Holy Sepulchre. The alphabetical charts of Bernhard von Breidenbach are to be seen as very much part of the pictorial program of that first European bestseller. Unfamiliar formulas and scripts could also serve magical or alchemical purposes at home. The alchemist Leonhard Thurneiser came back from his alleged 3 travels to the East with numerous phrases in languages like Syriac and Ottoman Turkish, which he had printed in their original script.